Ladies and gentlemen, threats and resilience. Now that we are less threatened and more resilient since President Trump empowered the Article 5, let me give the floor to His Excellency Sorin Ducaru, Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. Sorin, the floor is yours, Your Excellency Ambassador.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back home, and I'm extremely honored to be as well among my mentors. And when I see Minister Maleshkana, I always like to say that whatever good happened to me in the evolution, it's due to him and my other mentors, and whatever has not evolved in us is due to my irreconcilable stubbornness or so on. So thank you for that. It's great to be among colleagues from the ministry, also former colleagues from the North Atlantic Council, who, like Ambassador Tudor from Bulgaria, is now serving in Bucharest, and distinguished representatives from the official institutions in Romania, General Ciucă, Minister Vladica, Presidential State Councillor Constantin Ionescu, and many others. Speaking about the what we call the high-level NATO meeting in Brussels on the 25th of May, and it is, every high-level meeting is a summit, but this was not a summit like the ordinary every 2 years NATO summit with an agenda over a day or 2 or 3, depends on the context. It was one of those meetings in between the regular summits, and by the way, things like this happened before. They were even called mini-summits, but we somehow decided that nothing should be minimized when we speak about NATO summits and so on. So I wanted to give it to a clear and honest characteristics. This was about the following. It was about bringing together the leaders of the alliance at a very critical time in terms of threat landscape and in terms of dynamics in this landscape and NATO's own dynamic. It was focused on mainly 2 subjects, the burden sharing and resourcing, and bringing capability to the alliance to actually fundament and give credibility to the collective defense, which is at the core of NATO. And it was also about giving a special focus to the fight against terrorism with all its components, all together circumscribed under the agenda of NATO's adaptation and modernization. Before going into more details, let me put this event into a broader context, because the aspect of NATO's change and need to change, that was addressed in so many contexts by so many leaders, definitely also by the new US president, who in the campaign, expressed some of the known concerns about NATO not being so adapted, even using the word obsolete, but then in the meeting with the Secretary General expressing the understanding of the dynamic and the fact that NATO is not obsolete anymore, I mean, after this evaluation. Let me put this in context and express the fact that there have been a whole series of substantive changes in the evolution of the alliance over almost 70 years of its existence. And since I'm, a former geek, also have some hangover from my first profession, which is engineering, computer science, I would say that there was one operating system under the Cold War, I would call the NATO 1.0, that was definitely focused on the essence of collective defense, strong deterrence. And interestingly, it assured peace and stability and security over its member without actually shooting or firing a shot, which shows the importance, the preventive force of the alliance. Then, after the end of the Cold War, there was a period of some significant changes defined by what? By the engagement in operations, by the development of the partnerships that did not exist before, and by enlargement. And many other things, but these three elements define what I would call the post-Cold War NATO, the 2.0, that showed dynamism and reach out of this alliance in a new era. And around before the year 2010, while deciding to have a debate on the NATO's new strategic concept, the focus was very much on the emerging threats. It was in this context that the division that I lead has been established. There was a strong belief that the threat landscape will be mainly defined by potentially crisis, potentially in the NATO neighborhood or at distance. Definitely the NATO response to threats from terrorism, from cyber attacks, from potential other what would be the 21st century security challenges. It was a strong belief in developing these partnerships, including, and I quote from the strategic concept from Lisbon, a true strategic partnership with Russia. And it was in this context that we thought we were putting forward the 3.0 operating system. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the IT language, I can tell you that what we realized after 2014, the illegal annexation of Crimea and the stabilization actions in and around Ukraine, we realized in a way that we are not just living in an area of emerging challenges, but in an area of emerging and re-emerging challenges, some from the past, some that we thought would not come back, and they kind of blend together in a hybrid mix. And we realized that what the strategic concept from Lisbon is kind of beta version of what will be the operating system that we are going to define in the upcoming period. So something that has value, but that will be actually developed and is actually developed through the many changes. Coming back to the present, there have been a couple of important decisions taken first in Wales, like the Readiness Action Plan. That was an immediate response to the threats at the eastern frontier of the alliance. But then in Warsaw, we established like two strategic priorities for NATO, and this was a year ago, almost exactly a year ago. That of strengthening deterrence and defense, and that of projecting stability also around the alliance, both with the 360 degrees approach. It's not that deterrence and defense only works for, I don't know, the east or the north of the alliance and the other one from the south. No, both are valuable or are relevant from all geographical standpoints. And frankly, the high-level meeting that took place 3 weeks ago, not only that it reconfirmed some of the key aspects, like, for example, the burden sharing aspect. It was an issue, actually, that was reiterated with a strong commitment at Wales to reach 2% over a period of a decade, of 10 years. Now, at the high-level meeting, it was reaffirmed, and there were actually two documents that have been approved by the heads of state and government. One was a report on burden sharing and the way ahead, and one on report on NATO's role in fighting terrorism. And there was an agreement that this burden sharing means, yes, the 2%. And by the way, we have a commitment over 10 years, but doing it faster is better. So the faster a country reaches the 2%, the better. Aspect that was also emphasized at a meeting yesterday between President of Romania and US President. The fact that it means also contributions to operations and also output aspects, capabilities. We kind of use it in our jargon, the 3 C's. And it's not command control communications like C3, it's cash, capabilities, and commitments, contributions in operations. So all the 3 mean burden sharing. It's not just you put money in, it's important also how you spend it, what you take out, and also how you contribute in real life, in operations and missions, in enhanced forward presence, and so on. And also some plans, a commitment by every nation to come forward with some plans that would be transparent to each other in terms of these contributions. Which is it's a higher degree of transparency and cooperation. The second theme, the fight against terrorism. Again, here we do have a mandate that has started at least since 9/11, but was very much linked to the protection of NATO's troops in operations from terrorist attacks, because we had a lot of casualties from IEDs and so on, including Romanians, and we owe them a lot, those who have sacrificed their life in theaters, and many who were victims of such terrorist devices. Then in 2012, at the Chicago summit in the US, we developed a policy of NATO's role in fighting terrorism, which was focused on having overall awareness in the alliance, number 1. Number 2, developing even more capability to be ready to defend against this threat. And number 3, reach out to partners. This policy is still valid. What the meeting in May brought was a report with an updated action plan in this direction, with some special elements of focus and articulation. Number 1, when you speak about awareness, the idea of better using something that we did not have before, the intelligence division of NATO that was created only a year ago, to have this intelligence sharing with strong relevance over counter-terrorism aspects. Next, to invest even more in capabilities for the alliance, but also in our partnerships, and to also establish a kind of clearinghouse role for what NATO allies do bilaterally and NATO does as an alliance, bring more resources, either through common funding, which is always complex and controversial in NATO, but also through trust fund mechanism. The political decision to have NATO part as the counter-ISIL coalition, not to change necessarily the mandate of NATO of being engaged in fight and operational fight, but actually be there at the table and coordinate with all the participants in order to bring its have better effect of its contributions, either to the operations like AWACS, increased contribution, or to the process of training and supporting and equipping our partners, those that need it more, in order to address this aspect at its roots. So these were the key elements, and everything is wrapped up in the bigger story of NATO's longer-term adaptation and modernization. I will talk more about resilience and these aspects in the second panel, because I was invited initially to be taking part there. I will stop here. There's much more to say, but let me finish on one important thought. NATO was developed initially as a collective defense organization. In the Lisbon strategic concept, there were 2 new missions or core tasks that have been added: crisis management and cooperative security through its network of partnerships. I think we are at a time where we need to be able to operate both as a collective defense alliance, and we know what this means, like deterring first, and if necessary, defending or reacting above the threshold of an armed attack. But we should also be better prepared to prevent and also resist, and if necessary, to find ways also to react. I'm not saying necessarily respond militarily below the threshold of armed attack. Because we are living in a world where much of this is happening. Through cyber, through information manipulation, through hybrid manifestations. And it's not a simple period of peace. In some conference I heard the word, we are living in a period of violent peace. Some prefer to say it's a hybrid peace rather than hybrid warfare. But we need to be able to be relevant in between, and also fighting terrorism is part of this. So that's the challenge of the future transformation. And again, this is where we need to fine-tune the kind of operating system for the 21st century.
Thank you, Ambassador Ducaru. I will propose to you to think a bit about the definition of being resilient. Maybe resilient means non-vulnerable in both military and civilian aspects. Ambassador Charles Ries, Vice President, RAND Corporation. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Well, yes, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I must say I'm getting to Bucharest so often, I'm thinking I might get an apartment here. I really enjoy my opportunities to take part in Aspen Romania events, and I find the attitudes and the awareness of the challenges that we face in the modern world and in the Alliance so refreshingly present here that it's always a pleasure, and I learn a lot from participating. I've had the benefit of attending many conferences and symposia in Europe, and I'm always impressed by how particularly French and German participants set out their comments with a very explicit outline. You know, I have 6 points or 6 remarks or 6 propositions to make, and I think it must come somehow from the Sorbonne or German universities or something like that. But I'm going to try that with, I hope, the excuse of being a not quite as erudite American. I thought, first point, I thought that I would be today commenting upon the speech that's most famous for what wasn't in it than for what was in it. That is to say, the President's remarks at the high-level meeting 3 weeks ago in Brussels, in which there was not an explicit Article 5 pledge. Actually, I read the text. He did mention Article 5 in terms of the monument that he was dedicating, but he didn't make this explicit Article 5 pledge. And I would have said that this is the American commitment to Article 5 is a whole of government, whole of society pledge. It has been reiterated by the Vice President, the Secretaries of State and Defense, major congressional committees, and indeed kind of across the American intelligentsia. But I was saved all of that because of the pluck of a Romanian journalist yesterday who asked the question, and the President explicitly made the commitments that we were all looking for. So we're very glad for that. Second point, this whole contretemps, or this whole focus on the remarks basically inaugurating a memorial at the NATO headquarters, the new NATO headquarters building in Brussels, reinforces the risks of such events. I was, in my job, I was number 2 for Europe back in the George W. Bush administration, and in that capacity I was responsible for preparing George W. Bush's first trip to Europe some 16 years ago in June of 2001. And that included a similar meeting, the forgettable and now forgotten visit of George W. Bush to Brussels on that trip, at which it featured such a meeting of the allies, fewer at that time than now. And the problem with such meetings is they are not prepared. I mean, there really isn't the opportunity to have a serious discussion. There isn't the purpose that one gets from a properly prepared summit and sense of momentum, like Warsaw, Wales, and Chicago, and all the other summits that NATO has pulled off so well in the last few years. And when you have vague goals, you have either platitudes or gripes that come out in the remarks, and both of those are not particularly helpful. So I actually, and also when you do it with an American administration that has just come into office, you find that the internal policy development mechanisms are not fully developed in this case. Especially, there aren't the middle sub-cabinet level officials that develop policy propositions for White House consideration, and you have a White House staff that hasn't developed the sort of habits of coordination that they will surely get later. So there are risks. I think in the end, both the summit itself and the sort of postscript to the summit of yesterday, I think will fade perhaps in memory, but have other benefits. So third remark. I think in general, and as Sorin has set forth in detail, the NATO actually is in very good shape. The alliance has responded to the new international atmosphere and situation that we face. We heard remarks of the foreign minister and the chief of defense only reinforce the fact that we do understand that the world has changed. We do understand that the threats have changed, and we do understand the importance of the alliance. I would point out that in Washington, the president about 6 weeks ago put together and presented a outline for the coming fiscal year budget that significantly ramped up spending for the European Reassurance Initiative, and which in a generally lean budget that made devastating cuts elsewhere was quite a notable manifestation of Washington's and the Pentagon's and the State Department's understanding of how important the alliance is at this moment. The deployments in the enhanced forward presence and tailored response initiatives of U.S. forces at a time when our military assets are stretched around the world is again further demonstration that we understand that Europe is an important area of security for all of us, and that we need to work together with the alliance to do so. We also appreciate very much the commitment of NATO to the Afghanistan mission and the formal adoption of a terrorist mission that was announced, at least on the margins of the Brussels meeting. So, fourth remark is that I think that the attention, nonetheless, put aside my remarks at the outset about how dangerous these things are, this whole contretemps has perhaps accomplished what the U.S. has been interested in for some time, and I think Romania has been too, which is to raise the profile of the alliance, to build awareness of its importance. And this is ever more significant at a time in which the threats are changing, as we've mentioned, but then there are other epochal changes underway, most important of which is the changing relationship potentially changing relationship of the United Kingdom to the European Union, something that we're all concerned about and more baffled today than we were 2 days ago. Actually, a heightened profile is not such a bad thing. Fifth remark. It seems to me there is a lot of attention on this question of burden sharing and resources and so forth. But the most important arena for this particular debate is actually not in Washington, but in Berlin. And the biggest risks of the alliance being considered some sort of transactional relationship is that it could undercut the already weak support for defense expenditures in Germany. And so that, it seems to me, is quite the worry. I know that, of course, Germany has a national election this fall, and the dice are cast for such an election. But we all need to think about ways in which we can change the dynamic of the way that this issue plays out in Germany, because if the Germans can sustain a commitment to common defense commitment, that would really strengthen the alliance more than anything else. And in that connection, in some ways, the Brexit process and the transformation of the EU's own defense, attention to defense and the prospect of common defense expenditures, I think, speaking for myself, a long-term Europeanist, that has the prospect of changing the debate in Germany, and that would indeed, if it resulted in more capabilities to common defense for the European Union, but also redound to the benefit of NATO, especially since we've gotten past the zero-sum game approach to NATO, EU, and defense. So, sixth remark, I commend Aspen and NATO for the threats, resilience, and society theme for this meeting today. I think we have acknowledged that the threats are changing. The nature of resilience in many areas, but including in defense and security, is come to the fore as we recognize the challenges of preparing to succeed and prosper in an open society with new kinds of risks. And the society aspect of that tagline, emphasizing the need to build and sustain public support for the alliance. And finally, I just say on Sorin's operating system metaphor for NATO and the alliance more generally, it would seem to me that NATO 4.0, the operating system, is going to be like everything else in tech, mobile, and so we need to take it with us. And the support and the understanding of NATO isn't built and isn't sustained by occasional summits, declarations, and so forth. It's built and sustained every day in meetings like this, in member state capitals, in partner nations, and in the kinds of things that every one of us do every day to reference and inculcate the notion that an alliance is a commitment of the parties to the common defense. And hopefully the process and a little bit of drama that we've gone through in the last 3 weeks has raised the awareness of NATO, and that raised awareness is for the good. Thank you.
The next speaker, Bruno Lete, GMF US, Transatlantic Fellow. Bruno, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I'm very delighted to be here this morning on this beautiful day. I am fortunate to be able to travel to the region every now and then, and being back here in Romania is certainly a pleasure. I think that the issues at stake in this region deserve to be on the map. And I certainly want to salute Romania for its efforts to put those developments and those challenges clearly on the list of priorities, also in Brussels, which sometimes can be the institutional labyrinth that we know it is. Getting back to the panel, yes, NATO is in good shape. I think that's the overall message. Given the developments on both sides of the Atlantic in the past months, given the simultaneous multiplication of crises over the past years, I think indeed that I would agree with the other panelists that the alliance has adapted quite remarkably. Getting back to the Brussels meeting, there perhaps, what are the results there? I think there the answer is a bit more nuanced. I would like to divide it between the results in the military dimension and the results in the political dimension. Now, I think the Brussels meeting was good news for the military dimension of NATO, but in the political dimension, perhaps there's more space for speculation there. So getting back to what was achieved on the military front, I think there, yes, indeed, the president, the US president, Mr. Trump, confirmed his support for the military value of the alliance. I think that really puts to end any speculation whether or not he believes NATO is obsolete. So I think that was a good sign. The Europeans are finally getting serious about their defense spending. I think in Brussels, everyone recognized that more can be done when it comes to burden sharing. And truly speaking, President Trump there has a point. Pledges were made in Wales, and Europeans, I think, will finally move to reach those pledges. Let's not forget Montenegro was given a warm welcome as the newest member to the alliance. That still gives an important symbol for NATO's open door. And indeed, the alliance also joined the anti-ISIS alliance, which I think is very instrumental to complete NATO's reorientations towards the south. And of course, they also inaugurated a brand new, beautiful HQ. Let's not forget that too. So all in all, for a meeting that was announced with low ambitions, I think the results were actually quite significant. But the most interesting piece that was announced, and Ambassador Ries briefly talked about it, it's indeed this announcement that the administration will earmark $5 billion in the 2018 budget for the European Reassurance Initiative. Now, that's quite a bit of money, of course. This European Reassurance Initiative is designed to boost US military presence in Europe, to show that America still has Europe's back. And I think that this American fund cannot be, the value of it cannot be underestimated for European security. So all in all, so much has been written about the meeting, so much has been said about the meeting. Was it a disaster for US-EU relations? I think it was not. Was the Trump experience interesting for his European colleagues? Probably it was. Maybe the president was too blunt, maybe he was too outspoken, even perhaps unsophisticated compared to some of his elegant European colleagues, but that was to be expected. I think it only underlines that we should not only listen to what the president says, don't read the tweets, but also really look at what the administration is doing on the ground. And I think this is definitely something important to take into account. But that also brings me to my second point on the political dimension. It is actually this dysfunction that we are currently seeing between the White House and the US administration that bears concerns. I think it has the potential to erode US leadership inside the alliance and to erode the political dimension. In my perspective, the Brussels meeting was a clear signal that the White House does intend to lead from the back. It was with clear intention that the Article 5 quote was left out of the speech. Could we question whether America first is compatible with NATO solidarity? I think those are all fair questions to raise. But what really is here at stake is, I think, and this needs to be understood, is that the United States has always infused NATO with its unique coalition-building capacity. The United States has always been very instrumental in bringing together the alliance around shared interests. And I think with the current dysfunction between the White House and the US administration, that function comes under threat. And it's something that we need to clearly watch, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic. So in this regard, I think that what is it that will most define the future of NATO and the future of the alliance? It is this US and EU ability of leadership. That, in my eyes, is what matters the most to the future of NATO. Thank you.
You said, Bruno, about the European reassurance initiative, and this is very good to underline, because these days in Romania, and General Ciucă knows better than all us here, two huge exercises, Noble Jump and Saber Guardian, are proving that NATO's solidarity is working better than ever. There are 40,000 troops this year in Romania, General Ciucă. Approximately. I want 2 minutes, if it's possible, to discuss about this, because it's the first time in Romania that we have this big scale of exercises and 40,000 NATO troops. And perhaps if you could tell us, especially when we are talking about threats, what is the whole meaning of these two big exercises, Noble Jump and Saber Guardian?
How should I stay? Okay, so thank you very much for mentioning those two exercises. And I think it's good to clear that Noble Jump, it's a NATO exercise, which is designed to confirm the concept of VJTF, the concept which has been adopted at the end of summit in Wales 2014. So it proves, as you mentioned, the commitment of the alliance to show solidarity, also deterrence, and the ability to move this package of forces from the whole country of the alliance into the region of the Black Sea. So it's not only about Romania, it's also about Bulgaria, it's also about the neighboring countries like Bulgaria, like Hungary as well. So going to Saber Guardian, this is an exercise led by United States Army in Europe. It's an exercise which is proving the commitment of all the other countries and partnerships which are part of the, which has applied for taking part in this exercise. This huge number is not all, also deployed in, this huge number of soldiers is not deployed only in Romania, it's also deployed in Bulgaria and Hungary as well, and also some of them will go in Georgia as well. So I think, as you mentioned, it shows that NATO, it's proving that it's a very strong alliance. NATO, it's proving that whatever is going to happen, we will have a reaction and we will stay together in order to cope with all these new threats and challenges. So that's the most important, the quintessential part of those two exercises.
Thank you so much, General Ciucă. Ambassador Ducaru, please.
Thank you. Let me also underscore the importance of such events that show the credibility of NATO's capability and capacity to respond and prevent through the deterrent aspect of exercises major conflict. And by the way, whatever NATO has decided in the last years was definitely with a prevention focus, and it was very measured, proportionate, with a sense of actually showing commitment for the defense of its territory and population, but was very outspoken in sending a message. This is by no means any provocation, but to the contrary, message to avoid any provocation from the outside. So strong deterrence has also a strong prevention effort. But I also wanted to make some points or to respond to some very good points that were made by fellow panelists here, and Ambassador Ries mentioned that usually these meetings in between the big summits are not so prepared. They don't have, they're clearly not the same than the regular summits, that's clear. But I would never consider them as irrelevant. And believe me, from NATO's point of view, there's been a lot of preparation and good preparation. The importance is that setting these kind of meetings on agenda of political leaders in itself generates focus. I mean, many of us have been diplomats. When you set something on the agenda, you link it to the objective, automatically you generate focus. Imagine this was not on the agenda. This was just left for the regular NATO summit for next year. All these aspects would have been probably, in very low on the food chain of political interest and so on. So in itself, it was important. Let me also tell you about the meeting itself. I, for one, and I participated, and I know there has been a lot of writing about this, and not necessary. It was in this, in the perception of why was not Article 5 specifically mentioned, and then everything must have been bad. So that was the logic. It wasn't exactly the same. Actually, it was one of the most interesting and dynamic debates. There wasn't a sense of divergence, but there was a sense of different accents. And if you look back to NATO history, you can have a lot of other examples where the dynamic debate in the end led to the reinforcing of the unity. If we think about the documents that have been endorsed, again, they were in the same sense of unity and solidarity. About the what was missing, the Article 5 commitment in the speech, it was echoed a lot by the press. I was very much asked, and all the NATO leaders in conferences afterwards. I remember Deputy Secretary General at Globsec. I went to a conference in Finland and also in Tallinn, Estonia. I think the important point was, and I think it's a strong point, the meeting in itself was a commitment to the alliance, but also the hard fact of the investment of extra 5 billion euros to exactly defense of Europe in itself is a strong message. And then there's a whole, again, I participated in debates for those who, especially from those who come from the US, who were highlighting this. How could this subject between unconditional solidarity be reconciled with the fact that the burden sharing that was also committed by all is not happening with a dynamic that especially the US and maybe also others would expect. So how to create conditions to be to the full unconditional support by actually backing Article 5 with credible contributions, capabilities, and cash. because otherwise some adversaries might think it's a bluff, it's just a political thing. No, the strength of this alliance was not just the treaty in the Article 5. What this active solidarity based on capability, on credible capability, contributions, and of course resources. So one has to think about this. And then it's really good that yesterday there was a mentioning of a clear commitment. It was in a context, in a meeting with a country that made an effort like Romania to come to the 2%. Also a country that has shown over many governments and so on contributions and consistency in its support. And by the way, if one thinks about the following agenda, there was an announcement actually by the White House of an upcoming, I think it's linked to the G20 visit of President Trump in Poland, and I think also a speech, political speech was announced. So one would expect something like this. So I think all in all, one has to think these aspects in an evolution. Last but not least, let me definitely endorse point made by Charlie Ries about how should the 4.0, where should we aim? Yes, definitely mobile. I would say mobile, fast, connected, and a bit more digital than analog in a metaphoric sense. So we need to move a bit forward from the more conventional approach to defense and bringing up to speed to the digital world. And I think General Chuk highlighted some of these aspects in the priorities of the ministry, including in the future procurement and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Ambassador Ducaru. Ambassador Ries?
Yeah, well, obviously, Sorin, very perceptive comments. I didn't mean that these high-level meetings had no value. In fact, as I tried to establish, I think this one, in the end, turned out very well. They're risky, though. They're risky because they're not prepared to the extent that a full summit with a year of preparation is. And particularly for a new president that doesn't have the habit of going to these multilateral meetings, especially the meals, where you've got a large number of leaders around the table, all of whom want to say something, and he feels a little bit, well, do I respond to everything that's being said? Do I say only what I came in to say? And you have to appreciate, I think, and this is just a comment, not necessarily an excuse, you have to appreciate the fact that European ministers, European heads of government meet monthly, certainly probably more than monthly between NATO and EU obligations, and are very comfortable and accustomed to each other and the table and the tour de table tradition. An American president who has no previous government experience is a businessman. He has come through a very bruising presidential campaign and takes office in a circumstance in which he's very anxious to establish his leadership in a tricky time. This doesn't come naturally. And that, I think, as the president has more opportunities to have more quality time with more European leaders, as he has yesterday with President Ioannis, and now he's done a NATO high-level meeting, he's done the G7 in Sicily, he will do the G20, he will get more comfortable with this, and more importantly, if you can imagine, his staff and the White House and other national security decision-making parts of the U.S. government will get the machinery in gear. The final point I'd make is that because of the unique aspects of our political system, we haven't had ambassadors in the field since January at NATO or at the U.S. mission to the EU, or in London or in Paris and places like that that are important parts of preparing and understanding what kinds of concerns the other leaders will bring to such a meeting, and that's also part of the preparation. This is, as I say, very much at the sort of down in the weeds level of sort of day-to-day diplomacy, but it does matter. And given the fact that it was risky, given the fact that it seemed to, in the first instance, in the first 24, 48 hours, emphasize differences rather than commonalities among the allies, now with the perspective of 3 weeks, we can see the alliance for what it is, and we can put this particular contretemps behind us.
Thank you, Ambassador Ries. Bruno?
No, I agree that NATO is sometimes very good at debating its differences, but perhaps sometimes we should talk a bit more about its similarities and what unites us. And I do agree with you, Sorin, that the fact that the President did not mention Article 5 does not mean that the US is not committed to Article 5. Of course not. But, you know, sometimes in diplomacy, words can matter as much as actions, and when your words are not synchronized with actions, it can create ambiguity. And that perhaps is a little bit the issue that we were facing. But again, I think on burden sharing, I really appreciate your point that we have to make the link. And as a foreign minister also mentioned earlier, I think that also the initiatives that are launched now at the EU level, like the European Defence Fund or the European Defence Action Plan, will also really support that effort, those efforts at the NATO level. And yes, the fact that the United States did commit so much money now to this European reassurance initiative is very important, because I think that sometimes what we need to counter, I think, also in Washington, is the view that the less the United States would do, the more Europeans will do. That's not true. What we actually see is the opposite. The less the United States does, the less Europeans do. And that, of course, then when we have these decisions, these commitments from the United States, I think it also encourages Europeans to step up and give more punch.
Thank you, Bruno. Please.
Hi, my name is John Florescu, and I wanted to say hello to an old friend, Sorin, who was working with my brother, and Mircea Joana, who we saw as two fantastic ambassadors to the United States. I'm kind of interested just looking at this panel, because I'm reminded that just where the ambassador is sitting is where Ron Ziegler, Nixon's press secretary, sat, or stood up, I should say, at a lectern when Nixon came here on August 1st, 1969. And one is reminded of the close friendship that actually exists between the two countries that goes far before many events we're talking about today. And even next year, with the centenary celebration of Romania, I think people will be reminded of the fact that Romania doubled in size was because of the relationship between the Romanian delegation at Paris, at Versailles, and Queen Marie, and President Wilson. And President Wilson effectively assured the doubling the size of Romania at those negotiations. I'm interested because we always talk about an America First policy. And in a way, what you see now is a Romania First situation in Europe, because Romania is taking the lead in stepping up and showing the example, I think, not just to its own citizens, but to the American public, that they, honor their commitments. And I think it creates a great opportunity for Romania in European diplomacy to show the way forward in dealing with our US administration. Outside of that context and looking forward to next year, we have a congressional race in the United States. And I would guess that the Congress will move a little more in the direction of a Democratic representation. And as such, I think that the winds favoring a strengthening of NATO will only intensify. And so these two things come together rather fortuitously in the sense that we have Romania taking a strong lead. We have a Congress that I think may shift obviously in a pro-environment, in a pro-European stature, a little more of a conventional position than what we are seeing recently.
Thank you, John Florescu, also for confirming that very nice viral on YouTube, America first, Romania second. So with all this I've been saying, I want to thank the speakers, Sorin, Ducaru, Charles Ries, Bruno, Lete. Before Simona Halep give us the winner tiebreak this afternoon, we will give you a coffee break and see you back in 15 minutes with the second session. Thank you so much.